So this is part 2 of lecture 11. We're going to pick up where we left off. All right, so Lincoln is sort of using these time-honored traditional values like free labor to explain the purpose of the war. But even while he's reaching to tradition, Lincoln is also presiding over tremendous changes in Northern life, especially. They need to mobilize the resources of the Union, and that increased the power of the federal government. And it also increased the power of a sort of new class of industrial entrepreneur. Unlike the South, which suffered economic devastation, the North experienced the war as a time of prosperity. Industry was booming. There is price inflation. There's the government contracts that go to the businesses that supply the military. The textile mills in New England worked day and night to supply the army with blankets and uniforms, and the coal mines and the iron works expanded their production. A lot of industries mechanized very quickly, especially industries like boot production and meat packing, which were both super important for supplying the military. It takes a lot of boots to keep 2 million soldiers on the march, and it takes a lot of food. An army marches on its stomach. Now, every now and then you'll hear soldiers from combat zones kind of complain about the MREs, the meals ready to eat, but you don't hear nearly the complaints that you used to get. And in the Civil War, there was a lot of reason to complain. There was no Pure Food and Drug Act back then, so meat packing was not particularly clean, and it spoiled very quickly. Union soldiers were given rations of meat that often was not fit to be eaten. They were given rations of hardtack, which is a really hard-baked bread, and it is exactly as tasty as it sounds like. And at the start of the war, some of the hardtack that was being given to Union troops was actually left over from the Mexican War, which had ended 13 years before. One of the more remarkable changes we saw was in food production, particularly in agriculture. Hundreds of thousands of northern farm boys volunteered for the army. And that was a massive loss of labor, but farm production wasn't hurt at all. In fact, quite the opposite. It skyrocketed. There were a couple of reasons for this. The first is better technology. By the start of the Civil War, corporate farms and even some big family farms were able to make use of chemical fertilizers and mechanical reapers. Like Cyrus McCormick was selling 4,000 mechanical reapers a year, and he was one of close to 50 reaper manufacturers. And of course, it helped that the big producers got contracts from the government to supply the military, or they dealt with food packing companies that had those contracts, and that guaranteed income made it easier for them to afford the equipment that they needed. And then the second reason was immigration. Immigrants streamed in throughout the war. They pushed the farming frontier even further west. Sending sons to war could be a family tragedy, but it didn't hurt the economy at all. Like in Wisconsin, more than 90,000 men joined the Union Army. But the grain production in Wisconsin, the farm income in Wisconsin, and even the population of Wisconsin increased during the war, largely thanks to this immigration. The new American national state that developed during the war was committed to fast economic development. Congress adopted policies that promoted economic growth and ended up permanently changing the financial system. When each of the Confederate states seceded, when each of them left the United States, their congressmen, the members that they had sent to the Senate and the House of Representatives, had to decide, are they going to stay in the U.S. Congress, or are they going to commit treason and go to the Confederate Congress? And overwhelmingly, they chose to go to the Confederate Congress. There was only one congressman from a Confederate state who stayed in the U.S. Congress. That was Andrew Johnson of Tennessee. In Lincoln's second administration, in his second term of office, Johnson will be the vice president. But that means that the north to south ratio in the U.S. Congress was roughly infinity to 1. So all of those laws and policies that Northerners had wanted for fourscore and however many years, that they couldn't get because Southerners blocked it. Well, look at them go now. They can do whatever they want. To promote agriculture and to promote that land-based independence, Congress passed the Homestead Act. And the Homestead Act is something that small farm families had been clamoring for since Washington was, well, not even, since the Articles of Confederation were the government. The Homestead Act offered free public land to settlers heading into the frontier. 160-acre plots. Now, to get that, you would have to pay a small filing fee, and you would have to agree that you would spend 5 years living on this 160 acres. You had to live on the actual claim a certain number of months out of the year, and you had to make it profitable in some way. Plant a cash crop, or you would take up a tree claim. For some reason, tree claims were really popular in South Dakota. I'm not sure if you've ever seen pictures of especially western South Dakota. Not a whole lot of trees grow there naturally, and the government felt that part of civilizing the frontier involved removing the people who already lived there, and also making it look like the land back east, which meant trees. Unfortunately, because South Dakota is South Dakota, a lot of those tree claims, the majority of them, ended up failing because trees just don't have an easy time in that landscape. But regardless, the Homestead Act took effect the same day that the Emancipation Proclamation did, January 1st, 1863. And in some ways, it's like that proclamation. It is trying to implement the North's idea of freedom. A good society is one where small farm families have that economic independence. By the 1930s, more than 400,000 families owed their family land to the Homestead Act. Congress also passed another law that was very important specifically for this part of the country. They passed the Morrill Act, also known as the Land Grant Colleges Act. The Land Grant Colleges Act gave money to the states, or gave public land to the states. They could then sell part of it off to raise money, and the rest of it they would use to build, specifically, agricultural and mechanical colleges. Now, traditionally, universities taught liberal arts. They taught philosophy and law and Latin and Greek. But the land-grant colleges were supposed to provide training in practical subjects, crop rotation, how to fix those cool mechanical reapers, animal husbandry. Land-grant colleges were also required by law to cost less. A liberal arts university was basically limited to upper class or upper middle class men. And that holds true today. Like in Oklahoma, our land-grant college is OSU. OSU costs less than the University of Oklahoma. I mean, it doesn't cost a whole lot less. It's like $20 less a credit hour, but still, land-grant colleges, by law, must cost less than the flagship liberal arts university in that state. Land-grant colleges were also required to admit female students, which the vast majority of colleges and universities did not accept women at all at this time. Now, the land-grant schools didn't have to let women take the same classes as men. Typically, the mechanical classes would be for men, and women would take the domestic sciences, as they were called. Although, just a weird little aside, at Iowa State University, that was their land-grant college, for the first couple of years, their female students were not only allowed to take the same classes as their male students, their female students could also join their ROTC, which and that didn't last very long. People got kind of weirded out at pictures of teenage girls in their gigantic skirts and their puffy sleeves toting rifles. For some reason, that upset people. Many of the biggest schools today in the nation were originally these land grant colleges. There's OSU, there's K-State, University of Wisconsin, LSU, Purdue. Congress also gave away huge land grants for those internal improvements that they've been talking about since the turn of the century. They gave away nearly 100 million acres to two railroad companies, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific Railroads. And those companies were supposed to use that land to build a transcontinental railroad, one that would stretch from Omaha, Nebraska, all the way out to the Pacific coast. Those were the first corporate charters issued by the federal government since the Second Bank of the United States was created back in 1860. People had been talking about building a transcontinental railroad since the 1840s, but it was usually considered too big of a project to be practical. But the Union and Pacific Railroads completed that first transcontinental line by 1869. They employed 20,000 men, and a large number of them were immigrant Chinese workers. The Transcontinental Railroad ended up out in San Francisco, and it expanded the national market. It spread white settlement. It spread investment into the West, and it also helped to bring about the doom of the traditional lifeways of the Plains nations. And the need to pay for the war also produced changes in our financial policy. To raise money, the government increased the tariff to stratospheric rates, and that allowed northern industry to grow because regular folks couldn't afford imported goods anymore. Congress also passed new taxes on production. They passed the first income tax we'd ever had. It only affected the very, very wealthiest Americans. The government borrowed more than $2 billion by selling government bonds, and they created an immense national debt. They also started printing greenbacks, paper money. They printed more than $400 million worth of it. They chartered a system of national banks that would issue the greenbacks and buy government bonds, so loan money to the government. The state banks, we've been having problems with the state banks since the 1790s at least. Now they're driven out of business. Before the war, U.S. paper money was this chaotic mix of notes issued by state banks and local banks. But by the end of the war, there were only two kinds of currency: the federal greenbacks and the notes issued by the new national banks. A wartime economic policy really benefited northern manufacturers, especially those who had contracts to supply goods to the military. But it also benefited railroad men and banking men, and many Americans who will go on to be the leaders of the post-war economy created their fortunes during the Civil War. Men like Andrew Carnegie and John Rockefeller and Jay Gould and J.P. Morgan and Philip R. Moore. He was the guy who potted the meat for the army. They made themselves tremendously important to the government and to the economy in general. And of course, these captains of industry managed to not get killed in military service themselves by either buying exemptions to the draft or paying other men to go in their place. Now, taken together, all of these changes vastly increased the power and the size of the federal government. The federal budget in 1865 was more than $1 billion. It's 20 times the budget of 1860. The government also became the biggest employer in the country. With all of these new programs, you need like this army of clerks and tax collectors and other officials. A lot of that expansion will be temporary, but the government will never quite return to its weak, fragile pre-war condition. And for many northern women specifically, this conflict opened up new doors of opportunity. Women took advantage of the wartime labor shortage to take jobs in factories. We tend to assume that that started in World War II, but it happened in World War I, and it happened in the Civil War. We see women moving into professions like nursing that used to be almost entirely male. And the expansion of the federal government, their big hiring boom, that also opened up new jobs for women as government clerks. Now, many of these wartime jobs will be short-lived. They won't last much longer than the war did. But women found a permanent place in nursing especially, and in a number of white-collar government jobs. Hundreds of thousands of Northern women also took part in organizations that raised money and gathered medical supplies for the troops. They sent books and clothing and food to contraband camps and schools. Right after the war started, a group of Northern women were kind of clamoring for a way to organize relief efforts for the soldiers. And so in response, Congress created the U.S. Sanitary Commission. The U.S. Sanitary Commission took these local relief committees and they coordinated them. And they recruited this whole corps of nurses, and they raised money and they collected supplies. Soldiers writing back home would describe women from the Sanitary Commission like prowling around the army camps, checking out the conditions, making sure that the soldiers had what they needed, and kind of browbeating the hospitals into keeping their standards as high as anyone knew they could at the time. The highest positions in the Sanitary Commission were, of course, still held by men. But 3,000 Northern women worked as nurses, and tens of thousands more worked at the local level to roll bandages and raise money and just do whatever was needed. They organized sanitary fairs in the big cities like New York and Chicago and Buffalo so that small town groups could send representatives and they could see how they were all part of this larger movement, how they were part of this nationwide effort to support the troops. The first sanitary fair was held in Chicago, Illinois. They raised more than $100,000. The next year, they held one in New York City. That one lasted for 3 weeks. They raised more than $1 million. Over the whole course of the war, the U.S. Sanitary Commission raised just under $25 million to buy supplies for the troops. And of course, the nursing part of the Sanitary Commission is on the ball after battles and in emergencies. After the Battle of Shiloh, which was just a bloody mess, the Ohio Sanitary Commission sent 3 steamships to act as sort of these floating hospitals for the troops. Most men saw the women's activities during the war as an extension of women being naturally self-sacrificing and nurturing, etc. But by being volunteers in these aid societies and sanitary commissions, many Northern women were able to enter the public sphere and get a taste of independence. Young single women were the ones who went to the big sanitary fairs. They're the ones who got to go to Washington, D.C. and talk to Congress. They were the ones who got to work at the slightly higher levels because they didn't have children to care for. The women's rights movement, the suffrage movement, threw itself wholeheartedly into the war. But women's continuing lack of legal rights became increasingly humiliating as they got more and more involved. Many of the leaders of the late 1800s, early 1900s suffrage movement came out of this wartime volunteer work. Like Mary Livermore will be hugely important for the women's suffrage movement in the late 1800s. She started out working with the Sanitary Commission. She toured military hospitals to assess what they needed. She nursed injured and dying soldiers. She organized the Chicago sanitary fairs. But she couldn't vote, and she couldn't sign contracts on behalf of the Sanitary Commission. When that needed to be done, her husband had to sign for her. Her husband wasn't even involved in the Chicago Sanitary Commission. By the end of the war, she has a deep resentment, and she will use her considerable skills to organize the first women's suffrage convention. Now, despite this support, general support for the war, and despite Lincoln's political skills, the war and his policies did cause some divisions in Northern society. Republicans gave nasty names to people who opposed the war. They they called them copperheads, like these snakes. They blend in with the grass and then they strike without warning. But there were all sorts of changes happening. And there were thousands of people dying, and there was probably a little room for some questioning. The troubles were biggest among the southern-born populations in states like Ohio and Indiana and Illinois, and among working-class, mostly Catholic immigrants in the cities. As the war went on, it made existing social tensions worse, and it created some entirely new ones. The growing power of the federal government was a challenge to state politicians, and they didn't like that. The Union's draft caused a lot of resentment. The Union's draft had loopholes. It allowed a drafted man to pay a fee to get out of it, or to send a substitute in his place. And so wealthy men would buy themselves out, or pay poor men to put their bodies in harm's way. And money was a real source of tension. Workers resented manufacturers and bankers making huge profits from government contracts, but not raising wages. The labor movement in the North organized many strikes for better wages, safer working conditions. Throughout the war, the Democratic Party strongly criticized almost all of Lincoln's policies. Although the Democrats were kind of divided, there are pro-war Democrats who support the war but hate emancipation, and then there are anti-war Democrats who didn't support the war or emancipation or like anything ever that Lincoln did. And the sudden influx of runaway slaves created an extreme racist reaction in many parts of the North. Poor white citizens railed against the former slaves getting housing and education in the contraband camps, even though in reality, that housing was not great. The contraband camps were often very unhealthy places to be, and you could only be there, you could only live there in the contraband camps if you were providing labor to the military. So it's not like the contraband were getting anything great or getting anything for free. The draft, in particular, provoked an outburst of racist violence. Northern draftees resented being made to fight to free people who, in their opinion, would then compete with them for jobs. In July of 1863, when the Union draft first took effect, there was a 4-day riot in New York City. The mob was mostly Irish immigrants. They attacked the draft offices and the mansions of wealthy politicians and the black citizens in New York City who lived in terror. Many of them fled the city entirely or barricaded themselves indoors. 50 buildings in the black neighborhoods in New York were burned to the ground. The mob even attacked a black orphanage. The police were able to hold them back long enough for the children to escape. About 120 black people were killed in total, and at least 2,000 were injured. Now, in the Confederacy, it's much worse. The man in charge of holding the Confederacy together and rallying public support is not good at it. Jefferson Davis is the president of the Confederacy. He grew up in Mississippi. That's where his plantation was. He went to West Point. He's an intelligent, educated, eloquent man, but he is also kind of aloof. He doesn't have, Lincoln had this sort of common touch. He had this ability to connect with people from all different backgrounds. He had this sort of flexibility in his spirit, and Jefferson Davis just didn't. He was not able to communicate well to regular people. When Davis gave speeches about the war and the Confederacy and the glorious cause, he sounded pompous. And since the Confederacy didn't have a party system, he didn't have that support behind him to help him out. Southern leaders saw political parties as a threat to their national unity, which, fair enough. And as a result, Davis didn't have the kind of organization behind him that could help him mobilize support. And many of the Southern states had loved to talk about states' rights before they seceded. But under Jefferson Davis, the Confederacy was actually much more centralized than the Union was. The Confederate federal government raised their armies. The Confederate federal government took control of the Southern railroads. The Confederate federal government built the munitions plants. The states had nothing to do with that. No input in that. Davis is also not very good at dealing with the governors of the Confederate States. They've all got their own ideas about how the war should go, what their responsibilities are. One of the worst, from Davis's point of view, was Governor Joseph Brown of Georgia, who spent the entire war criticizing everything that Davis did. All in all, Davis faced a very difficult task and was not up to the job. James McPherson he's a Civil War historian, probably the best currently living Civil War historian. He has suggested that if Lincoln were president of the Confederacy and Davis had been president of the United States, the Confederacy would have won. Certainly, Lincoln would have made much better use of Robert E. Lee than Davis did. As the war progressed, social change and internal tension took over most of the Confederacy. At the beginning, most white Southerners rallied to the Confederate cause. Not all, but most. Southern soldiers spoke of the cause in the language of freedom, just like Northern soldiers did, although they've got a very different idea of what freedom meant. One Confederate volunteer wrote, "We are fighting for our liberty against the tyrants of the North, who are determined to destroy slavery." This man didn't seem to see any contradiction at all in what he was writing. But as the war went on, public dissatisfaction became even worse in the Confederacy than it was in the Union, and the South found itself increasingly divided. The biggest grievance involved money, and especially the way that money played into the draft. The Confederate draft is kind of like the Union draft in that it allowed wealthy men to pay a substitute. However, the Confederate draft went one step further for plantation owners. It exempted one white man for every 20 slaves. So a small planter, one who barely qualifies as a planter with 20 slaves, would get one exemption. He would not have to serve. He doesn't have to pay a fee, and he doesn't have to find someone else to serve for him. He just doesn't have to go at all. A big planter with 100 slaves, he could exempt 5 men, so he doesn't have to fight. His sons don't have to fight. Maybe his overseer doesn't get drafted. Joshua Ward of Georgetown, South Carolina, had 1,130 slaves. That's 56 exemptions. 56 of his nearest and dearest, kicking back with brandy and cigars, while the poor men of his county get shot to hell. That causes some tension. In fact, there were 16 men across the Confederacy who held more than 500 slaves each, and between them, these 16 men amounted to nearly 600 exemptions. Not 600 who paid somebody else, 600 who literally had to do nothing. At the end of the war, when the big planters are complaining, "Oh, we've lost all the slaves, they've lost all their money," you can imagine how much sympathy that caused among families who had lost all their sons, or among men who had lost an arm or a leg. Poor men and and small farmers began to call this war a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. The economy caused problems in other ways. As the Anaconda Plan, that blockade, actually started to work, parts of the Confederacy came under Union control and slaves ran off and production fell. The South suffered massive shortages of every essential commodity, corn and meat and even salt. The war left countless farms and plantations and businesses and railroads in ruins. That economic crisis for the Confederacy was a sharp contrast to the boom that was happening up north. Now, this crisis was probably unavoidable, but Confederate policies made it even worse. War requires sacrifice. That's something that the United States has understood since before the Revolution, when we had boycotts and we spun our own cloth. We understood it in World War I with the Victory Gardens. We understood it in World War II with the rationing. We'd like to pretend that we don't need to sacrifice today, but that's bull. We just push the sacrifice onto military families instead of sharing it equally. And in the Civil War, instead of sharing it equally, Confederate politicians pushed the bulk of the sacrifice onto small farmers. Many non-slave owners, which was the majority of the white South, became convinced that they were bearing the largest share of the war's burdens, and they were right. Like the Union, the Confederacy borrowed heavily to pay for the war. Unlike the Union, though, the Confederacy would not raise the taxes needed to pay off that debt. Well, let me clarify. They wouldn't raise the taxes on plantations. They would raise the taxes on small farms. Most of their tax revenue came from the lowest income groups. The Confederacy also had fewer banks to issue government bonds, so instead, the Confederate government printed paper money. Well, the Union government had printed paper money too, right? They'd printed in the Union $400 million of paper money. The Confederacy printed $1.5 billion of paper money. By the end of the war, people were using Confederate notes as wallpaper, like to patch cracks in the ceiling, because that was all it was worth. The Confederate Congress also allowed the Army to seize farm goods to supply themselves and to pay small farmers for the loss of their property with these increasingly worthless notes. Small farmers were really chafed by this. One guy in Georgia later said that the rebel army treated him worse than Sherman did. They took his hogs, they took his horses, they took his mule. Many small farmers supported the war at the beginning to protect what they saw as their economic future, but they end the war in poverty and debt. Food riots broke out in most of the southern cities, especially in Richmond. In 1863, a massive crowd of women broke into the Army's food storage and just carted it all off. In 1862, Joshua Moore, a slave owner in northern Alabama, commented that he believed that slavery was actually hurting the Confederate war effort. He said, men who don't own slaves, men who have no interest in this, are not going to fight a long war to save it. They will tire of it and they will quit. And he was right. As the war progressed, more and more men began to desert the Confederate Army. By the end of the war, more than 100,000 men, more than 10% of the Confederate Army, had deserted. Almost all of them were poor men and small farmers. These are guys whose families need their labor or can't live without their income, because a soldier's wage is being paid in Confederate notes that can't buy squat. After a while, the Confederate Army adopted this kind of informal policy that they called harvest furloughs. Men would kind of be allowed to desert in the spring for the planting, in the fall for the harvest, and as long as they came back, there was no questions asked. One officer said that his men can't be expected to fight for a government that will let their wives and children starve. By 1864, There are organized peace movements in several southern states. There are secret societies throughout the Confederacy that are actively working to bring it down. And just like in the North, Confederate military tribunals cracked down hard on dissent. They imprisoned hundreds of Unionists. Others were violently driven from their homes. A handful were executed by the Army. But Southerners who were loyal to the Union, who were loyal to the United States, made a significant contribution to U.S. victory. By the end of the war, about 50,000 white Southerners from Confederate states had actually served in the Union Army. One of the most celebrated Southern Unionists of the war was Elizabeth Van Lew of Richmond, Virginia. She came from a slave-owning family, but when her father died, she had persuaded her mother to free all of the family's slaves. And during the war, she often visited Libby Prison in Richmond. Union prisoners were held there, and she would, take food. She would take, muffins and things to Union prisoners of war, and she had information. She had a spy ring. Just going to be really blunt here. Elizabeth Van Lew was in charge of a spy ring, and she would take the information that she got from her spies, who were almost all her family's former slaves, and she would take these eggshells and she would poke a hole in the eggshell, and then you can blow the innards out without busting the shell. And then she would roll up really tight pieces of paper with this information and hide it in the eggshells, and then take these eggs to Libby Prison. Oh, she's just being a good Southern lady, right? She's just, delivering this food. Oh, you don't want the poor prisoners to starve, even if they are damn Yankees. But in reality, they're not cooking those eggs. They're finding out about Confederate troop movements. Mary Elizabeth Bowser, this lady, she was essentially the lieutenant in Elizabeth Van Lew's spy ring. She's a former slave of the Van Lew family. She had been hired to work in the Confederate State House. She was a paid servant to Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy. She was allowed to serve him tea and served meals when Confederate officers were visiting the State House, to Jefferson Davis and members of his cabinet, to members of the Confederate Congress. And those men acted like she was deaf or stupid or both. And they would just say anything. I mean, they would talk about troop movements, they would talk about troop strength, they would debate strategy and tactics, and she was there to hear all of it. And so she would pass that information on, and her fellow former slaves from the Van Lew family would pass it on to Miss Libby, and then she would go to the prison and give this information to the Union soldiers, and actually help some escape as well. Slaves in general were a tremendous source of information. Slaves who'd run away to Union lines, and even some slaves who remained in the Confederacy just to spy. But the war placed unusual burdens on Southern white women, on Northern women, but especially on Southern white women. They're left alone on farms, often for the first time. They have to learn to manage business affairs. Some of them had built up some of those skills before, but now with the men gone, there's no one to back up their decision making. And again, they can't sign contracts. They can't do most legal things. Just like in the North,